So I'm the older one. I'm Shrum. My friend James Carville likes to call himself a political icon. I was a political hack for decades, and I'm now the Warsaw Professor and Director of the Center for the Political Future at the University of Southern California. I first talked with Robert Costa back during the 2012 campaign when he was at National Review. And the first time he called me, he said, look, I'm going to report this stuff straight. And we talked a lot during that campaign.
We did.
He's had a meteoric rise in journalism, first at National Review, then at the Washington Post, now at CBS News. With Bob Woodward, he has authored a remarkable book entitled Peril, on the final period of the Trump administration and the first phase of the Biden administration. I'm going to just start off with a question I think everybody would want to know the answer to. What was it like to work and write with Bob Woodward, who's been a legend for half a century?
It's great to be here, and thanks to Jamie and the whole team, and especially to Bob Shrum, a great friend. Even though he's at USC and I went to Notre Dame, we can still be friends. It's bipartisanship in the
I think there are
sports
more
sense.
SC people here than Notre Dame.
I know. I got to be careful even expressing my biography in this crowd. I sat with some Trojans last night at dinner. It's okay. Wonderful school. Great research institution as well as a great football program. But Bob Woodward. So I joined the Washington Post in January of 2014. And Bob Woodward hadn't written for the Washington Post in terms of a news article for 5 to 10 years. But I would see him pop into the newsroom a few times, and I didn't know him at all, but I would say to my colleagues, I sat next to Phil Rucker, who's here, I said, is that Woodward? Yeah, that's Woodward. He's visiting a few people, I guess, in the newsroom. And so one time I just went over and introduced myself. I said, I'm Bob Costa, the national political reporter here at the Washington Post. He said, I'm reading you, and good to meet you. And we just started talking and formed a rapport talking reporting. And then in late 2014, 2015, we started talking more about the 2016 campaign. And by the end of 2015, he and I would speak regularly. There's obviously a major generation gap. Bob turns 80 in March. I'm 37. But we had kind of a very similar approach to reporting, which is get the documents. I remember one time he told me on one story about Trump, really ask the source for the documents. Don't just get the background information. And it became a major front page story. I got the memos that Roger Stone sent to Trump during the beginning part of the campaign complaining about how Trump wasn't taking any of his advice. And Woodward thought that was great because I got the documents. I didn't just get somebody's chit chat and put it in the front of the Washington Post. I got something to prove it foundationally in a memorialized way. And long story short, it's a longer story, but long story short, in the end of 2015, the campaign's really heated up. Trump's been running for about 6 months. And Woodward comes by the newsroom again. And I say to him, I think Trump has a real shot at this nomination. He says, oh, come on, really? And I said, I do. And I think not only does he have a real shot at the nomination, I think he has a shot at the presidency. Because I have been covering Trump at that point since 2011, had covered every single one of his events. And I just saw this nationalistic populism that was growing inside the conservative wing, the hardline immigration side of the Republican Party. And I said to Woodward, look, I really think he's going to get the nomination if this continues. And Woodward, I'll always remember this. He says to me, if you believe that's true, you need to sit him down and ask him the governing questions. I said, well, what do you mean? He said, ask him how he will use power. Stop just covering the horse race. Ask him what he thinks of the presidency. What does he think of the power of the presidency? How does he see the rule of law? How does he see foreign policy? Because if you believe as a reporter he's going to potentially be the next commander-in-chief of the United States, it's your responsibility, he said, almost pointing his finger at me, to go ask him the tough questions about governing. So I thought about it for a moment, and I said, well, why don't you ask him with me? And he said, really? And I said, yeah. So I called up Hope Hicks, and I said, Bob Woodward and I would like to interview Donald Trump about governing questions, about the presidency. And she said, what are you talking about? And so we wrote a list of questions that were really big picture, meaty questions to try to get Trump to focus ahead of the interview, that this wasn't going to be a typical interview. And so on March 31st, 2016, Bob Woodward and I sat down with Donald Trump in his unfinished Washington hotel, and we did the first story Woodward had done in a long time for the Washington Post, a front page story, 90 minutes long, with Donald Trump. And if you want to read that interview, it's available online as a transcript or in the Trump tapes. It's the first chapter of Woodward's new book about his interviews with Trump.
For which Trump is suing him.
$50 million. I had nothing to do with that book. I wrote Peril with Bob. I'm not named in the lawsuit. But so we interviewed Trump, and Woodward and I really had a productive experience doing that together. And he ended up writing Rage later about fear and then rage. And if you've ever read the book Fear by Woodward, if you open up the first page of the book, it says a quote. And it says, quote, "Real power is dash, I don't even want to say the word, dash, fear." And then it says, Donald J. Trump to Bob Woodward and Robert Costa, March 31st, 2016. So one of Woodward's best-selling books begins with a quote from the interview we did together. And then he wanted to do his second book, and to keep the good luck charm going, if you open up his second book on Trump, Rage, the first page of the book says, quote, "Rage, I bring it out in everybody, I always have." Again, Donald Trump to Bob Woodward and Robert Costa, March 31st, 2016. So his first two books on Trump began with quotes from our interview. And then in the fall of 2020, he was going to write a third book on Trump, and he called me up around Thanksgiving, and he said, instead of just using the quote, why don't we do it together? And I said, let's do it. And we did.
And how did you get access? I mean, you talk about, by the way, before I ask the question, if you thought Trump could win at the end of 2015, the Hillary Clinton campaign should have paid you a lot of money to give them some advice because they were rooting for Trump. They wanted to run against Trump.
I used to go up to Brooklyn to visit with them, and I was taken aback by, don't need to name names now, but how many people really wanted Trump to be the nominee. But I have a lot of history with Donald Trump. I also have a lot of history with Bernie Sanders. And just real quick, my approach to reporting is I have it above my computer screen as I write, and it's two words: assume nothing. Because I believe assumptions really hurt journalists when they start to assume things about people. And I remember when I first started covering politics in the U.S. Senate, a world Bob knows so well, I started seeing this senator that no one talked to. He had crazy white hair. And I said to people in the press corps, who is that? And they said, that's Senator Bernie Sanders of Vermont. I said, well, why does nobody talk to him? Well, he's wild, he's crazy, he's a socialist from Vermont. I said, okay, but no one talks to him? No one. So I started talking to Bernie Sanders. And Bernie Sanders and I started really talking politics. And I thought, this guy is a serious person. I mean, people make assumptions about how he looks. He's a serious guy. And in 2014, I got together with Bernie Sanders for breakfast, 2014, 2 years before 2016. And Bernie tells me he's thinking about running for president. And so I go to the Washington Post, it was on background at the time, and I say to the Washington Post, I got a real scoop for you. Bernie Sanders is thinking about running for president. I remember my editors goes, who is Bernie Sanders? And why is this a story? I said, no, this is a real story. We're doing this. And in the summer of 2014, I wrote the first ever story about Senator Bernie Sanders thinking about running for president. And you know who never forgets about that? Bernie Sanders. I was with Bernie Sanders when he announced his presidential campaign outside the Capitol. I remember tourists walking by being like, is this someone who's homeless, or why is this person? I went to Iowa with him in 2015 when he first went to Iowa. And I remember he was at the Drake Diner, and all these old hippies were trying to talk to him, and he had always wanted to just talk policy, and he's a fascinating guy. But he wasn't taken seriously because for many in the Clinton campaign, he was Bernie Sanders, the guy who sat in the middle seat of an airplane in coach and kind of relished that. But he is a political warrior. And Donald Trump, you may love him, you may hate him, but that guy is relentless in terms of his public ability to take political pain. And Bernie Sanders, people make assumptions about him, and that's why, as a journalist, I always try to just be open to change and open to things breaking political dynamics in this country.
How does Woodward, and now you, how do you get access
Yep.
to some of the sources that you have? How do you get people to tell you all this stuff?
Well, I can't give away all the secrets, Bob. But I'll give you an example, and I'm just going to use you as the example, Bob. But if I wanted to interview Bob Shrum, he's written a great book, No Excuses, about his career. And if I wanted to write a profile for the Washington Post, I could read his book and then maybe sit down with Bob at USC for 30 minutes, 45 minutes. And Bob probably has, and I would maybe say to Bob, well, what was it like growing up? Tell me where you grew up. What were your parents like, Bob? And he'd give me an answer for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, and I'd write it down. I'd go back and I'd write my article, and I'd be done with it. And Bob Shrum would be sitting there at home in LA and going, got through another profile. The guy didn't dig deep at all. Because that's how most people in public life in American politics, they believe that they can kind of skim the surface of the truth and get away with telling reporters their version or a segment of things. Woodward's method, not to give it away, but it's pretty obvious to all the people who've sat with us for this book, is if I sat down with Bob Shrum in my house in privacy for 2 hours, then 3 hours, then 4 hours, and I asked him about his parents and his family, the stock stories he tells everyone about his family, whether he's sitting next to them at dinner, the 10 to 15 stories, I call them, about your family or something sensitive, they finally comes to a point where they get exhausted and that you can't keep repeating the talking points about your life. And at that point, maybe it's 4 hours in, and I would have this method. Woodward would say to me, how long was that interview with that source today? I said, 6 hours, and I ordered 3 pizzas. Or for another source, I had 2 cases of beer. And you would just keep the source there and talking. And you have to have chronology. Chronology is everything. If I asked you, what were your parents like when you were a kid? You're going to go, well, they were nice. They sometimes disagreed. But if I came to you over a 4 or 5 hour conversation, maybe 6 hours over 2 days, and I said, I've heard that on August 19th, 1967, your mother said this to your father. And you go, oh boy, she did say that. And then I say, what else did she say? There's going to come a point in this long, long discussion where you turn to me and you go, let me tell you the truth about my parents. And then that's where you get the story. And with January 6th, for example, I would have these winding interviews with people about January 6th. But after 6 or 7 or 8 hours, 4 days, 5 days, 3 weeks, there would come a point where they would finally slump and they would be overwhelmed that you have all the chronology in front of them. And you would lay it out and they go, okay, let me tell you what really happened. And let me pull up my email. Here's the document I got. And it's not, people think it's like breaking them. It's getting them to a point where they can accept discussing the truth. And it takes time. Woodward calls it the luxury of time. Journalism is cursed by the rush to publish and the rush to get things on air. But to get to the truth, and this applies to friendships as well, you have to take, or family, you have to take the time to understand.
I think I've told you this before, but I'll say it here. Back when Bob was doing other books, and I know him pretty well, he would come to me and he'd say, listen, I really want to talk to you, and I'll be careful and respectful, and you don't need to worry about anything. Will you cooperate? I said, no.
I get it.
Look, Peril is a gripping saga of a campaign unlike any other that I remember. Obviously, an unprecedented time to run a campaign in, and an unprecedented aftermath. Can you discuss the most important and compelling revelations in the book?
Sure. So we signed the book deal. I said, Woodward came to me around Thanksgiving 2020, and at the time I was doing 3 jobs at once, which is not healthy for work-life balance. I was hosting a show on PBS called Washington Week for 4 years. I was doing Washington Post full-time and MSNBC every day. And then Woodward said, if we're going to do this book, we're going to do this 12, 15 hours a day full-time. And I said, I'm going to resign from all my jobs then, and I'm going to focus on this. And we thought we were going to write a book about the 2020 campaign and maybe the beginning of Biden. In December 2020, we signed the deal with Simon & Schuster around December 15th. About 3 weeks into the book, what happens? January 6th. And we had to turn our whole focus into digging deep on that. And I think for history, it was important to just adjust, be open to change, as I say. And I'll remember it for the rest of my life. On January 5th, because I was not working for the Post and I was on full leave, paying my own medical, I was on full leave because I wanted full freedom to do long-form investigative research. I could spend all this time roaming around D.C. talking to people. And on January 5th, 2021, I was outside the Woodward Hotel at 11 o'clock at night because I got a tip that this group called the Proud Boys was down there. And I remember I was I think I was the only reporter there, as I recall. It was freezing cold at night. I'll never forget the rats because the city was empty and there were all these people who were congregated living in the street that night, fighting with the cops. The city was empty. It was eerie. And I heard that Giuliani and Bannon were in this hotel, the Willard, right across from the White House. And Woodward said to me, be careful, because these people were wild in the streets. And they were there I never would have thought there would be an insurrection the next day. But there was some unsettling things happening in the streets. And Woodward said, can you get inside to see if Giuliani's there? I said, the Willard won't let me inside because it's a security concern. Only hotel guests can go inside the Willard. He said, just stay outside. I said, I kept taking notes and took a lot of notes, talked to people. And then around 11:30 at night on January 5th, 2021, I was freezing my ass off. And so I said, I'm going home. One of the biggest mistakes in my life is that I didn't just book a room in the damn Willard. Because I knew what was happening, but I could have spent $250 and just got in the room to see all this craziness inside. But what we ended up finding is that, and I know people, some right of center people, right people, don't like to hear the word insurrection, but what we found is that this was a coordinated pressure campaign to weaponize the vice presidency of the United States. And if you'll indulge me for just 2 minutes here, a minute. And the most important things to remember is that on December 31st, 2020, Donald Trump was preparing in the morning to do his favorite thing of the year, which is to celebrate New Year's Eve at Mar-a-Lago. There's nothing Trump enjoys more than the New Year's Eve bash at Mar-a-Lago. In the afternoon of December 31st, 2020, Donald Trump does something very unusual without alerting the press corps. He decides suddenly to leave Mar-a-Lago and fly back to Washington. And if you look back at the press reports at the time, there was bewilderment. Why was Trump not attending? There was no advisory on why he was leaving Mar-a-Lago early. What we found is that on December 31st, 2020 in the morning, Trump has a series of calls with Steve Bannon, Rudy Giuliani, and other advisors. And they say to him, you have to get Pence off the ski slopes in Colorado, get him back to Washington, because this is our last option. We need to use January 6th as the moment to push this election into the House of Representatives. And you got to stop partying at Mar-a-Lago and get yourself back to Washington. And if you look at the image of Trump coming off Marine One at the White House on December 31st, 2020, he looks very angry as he gets off the helicopter and says nothing to reporters, which again was unusual, and goes into the White House. And the evening of New Year's Eve, December 2020, sets into motion a series of events that almost led to a constitutional crisis in this country and the overturning of a presidential election. Because from January 1st to the night of January 5th into the morning of January 6th, you had perhaps the most intense period of a president trying to stay in office using what we found was the John Eastman rationale. And I remember when we discovered this memo, 2 pages, 6 parts, it's a blueprint for a coup. And Trump was presented this in early January as he's thinking through what to do. How can I stay in power? And Chuck Todd has said, and others, the most important thing from this book is that we found the Eastman memo, because it goes back to Woodward's point of find the documents. We have proof that a coup was being planned inside the White House. This wasn't talk. The memo, and Eastman's now under federal investigation, is there. The first subpoena issued by the January 6th committee, this only citation in the subpoena is Peril, because we showed that Bannon was talking to Trump about overturning the election. That led to Bannon's subpoena before the January 6th committee, which led to him being the first person indicted since the 1980s for defying a congressional subpoena. But what happened was Trump was presented this crazy idea of claiming that there were so-called alternate electors in states because people were claiming on social media in a Facebook group that they were alternate electors. Now, that they were not recognized by governors. They were not recognized by state legislatures. But Eastman said to Trump, forget about whether they're official or not. If they are claiming it on social media, if they are congregating, then we will claim they are alternate electors, and Congress and the vice president must consider them potential alternate electors. And because of that confusion over whether we should count them or not, the election has to go into the House of Representatives. And this is a hard thing to follow. It's a ping-pong ball of a plan. But what they wanted to do is create confusion about the electoral count. So then the election goes to the House. And as you all know by now, what happens if an election goes to the House? It's voted on by delegations, not by the majority of members. So the Republicans actually had more delegations in the House of Representatives in January of 2021. So there was a slim opening for Trump to win another term if the election got to the House of Representatives. And that's what Trump wanted. That's what Trump seized on. And on January 4th, 2021, Trump brings Pence into the Oval Office with John Eastman. And he says to Pence, and this is in the book, listen to John, Mike. You have to do what John is saying. All we want you to do, Mike, he says, is go up to the lectern on January 6th and say, I don't know about this. Not really sure about this count. We're going to need to take a big delay. We're going to need to let the state legislatures consider these alternate electors. This may need to go into the House of Representatives. Pence knows he can't do this, tells Trump he can't do this, but it got very close because if Pence buys in, you would have had not only objections on the floor of the Senate and the House, but you would have had the person constitutionally who is supposed to oversee the process walking away. So you would have the current president and the current vice president effectively saying they couldn't trust the electoral count. They couldn't trust that the election was legitimate. And that would have, in the minds of Trump people, sparked a crisis about whether Biden should be allowed to take office. Pence ultimately relented, and we found in the book that Pence on January 5th, 2021, was in the Oval Office. And Trump, and was again, a lot of stuff in her book, people couldn't believe it. They read that Trump opened the door on January 5th, 2021 to hear the mob outside, that same mob I was walking among outside the Willard. People said that's crazy. It was freezing outside. Thank gosh for the January 6th committee and grand jury stuff, because it's now been confirmed under oath that Trump opened the door to hear the mob out in the streets across on Freedom Plaza. And when Pence comes into the Oval Office on the night of January 5th, he says to Pence, if they want you to do it, wouldn't you do it, Mike? Wouldn't you want to do it, Mike? And he goes, no, I can't do it. I can't do it. It goes back and forth. Mike, if you don't do it, I don't want to be your friend anymore. And it was the ultimate pressure campaign. Pence is a complicated political figure. That's another whole conversation. I've covered him in the House for years and as governor. But at least on that night, he relented from Trump, and he relented the next day. But Pence was so uneasy about Trump, he doesn't even come to the White House on January 6th. Goes straight to the Capitol after he releases his letter.
And refuses, when the insurrection starts, to get in a Secret Service car and be driven away.
That's right, because he knew, as did all the Pence allies, that the purpose of January 6th for many of these attackers, the insurrectionists, was not just to have disruption that day and cause chaos. They wanted to delay the process. Because what was Trump doing? The whole thing, if you look back on it and read it carefully, it was about delaying so that Trump could pressure state legislatures to reconsider their electoral counts. They needed to delay the process. It wasn't necessarily going to happen that day that Trump would win, but they needed to delay the process so that a House election could somehow come to the fore and be an option. And people still now, they go, that's such a wild Rube Goldberg scheme of this and this and this. True, but it was put into action as a possible play.
How close did we come to?
Well, the Capitol was attacked.
Yeah, but at the end of the day, even though Pence, not Trump, told the Defense Department to send in the troops and clear the Capitol, Trump didn't do that. At the end of the day, they did confirm the election, and Pence did do his constitutional duty.
And that's why I told you the story about December 31st, because what I often wonder about as a reporter, having really dug deep on the post-election period, is suppose Trump had gotten started sooner. So much of what prevented Pence from taking action was that Pence was not given any kind of evidence from the Justice Department. He was not given any kind of legislature imprimatur that something was happening out in the states. But as we paint in our book, Pence was always checking in about whether anything Trump was saying had any meat to it. And the January 6th committee did very important work in the sense of it showed that Trump was trying to take control of the Justice Department. Why? Because he wanted to he hated that Barr, the Attorney General, wouldn't give him what he wanted, which was evidence and a reason to step in and say this election's illegitimate. He needed the AG and the DOJ to do that so the states could then take more action to redo their electoral counts. This was all about pushing in an official way that the election was illegitimate so that Pence and governors and state Republicans could then point to evidence or point to some kind of finding and say, this is the reason we have to resend our electors. This is the reason the election must go to the House. But this all doesn't really start until late December, early January. But imagine if it had started in November. Giuliani and Trump, as we document, were on this other whole path of trying to litigate for 6-7 weeks in November into December, and it failed miserably. And it's only after, this was the final last shot, but suppose this was the first option they had pursued. Now, they have reformed the Electoral Count Act. It doesn't get enough attention. The senators have come together with the House to raise the threshold from 1 member of each chamber to about 20. But I still do wonder, when you ask how close we came, and okay, so they've raised the threshold, but it's still a relatively minimal threshold. And in an age where truth is debatable, it worries me as someone who's out in the country reporting all the time that conspiracies about elections and disregard for the rule of law very much persists. And at January 6th and Pence's decision doesn't just make this all go away.
Oh, that's absolutely, I mean, Carrie Lake is running around in Arizona calling herself the governor-elect or the governor.
She's at the U.S. Senate today having meetings.
I mean, she lost by 17,000 votes, and she keeps saying, here's what I'm going to do on my first day as governor.
And know who one of her chief strategists was? Steve Bannon.
I want to get to Biden, but I first want to spend a little more time on this because it's so fascinating. At the outset of the book, you write about the role of General Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. First of all, calling his Chinese counterpart and saying, nothing crazy is going to happen. We've got this under control. And then basically gathering the military leadership together and saying, if you get a sudden order to engage in a military strike, you got to call me first. It almost reminds me of what James Schlesinger did when he was defense secretary, when Richard Nixon was about to resign from office.
And I think the Milley part of our reporting is significant, not to sound like we're bragging about it, but it matters historically for the reason Bob just mentioned. It has echoes of what happened during the final days of Nixon with Secretary Schlesinger. General Milley is chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff still to this day, but he is not in the chain of command, and he is the president's chief military advisor. So he has to take steps at times, based on our reporting, to preserve the stability of military relations across the world and to make sure that things that are happening in the United States are not misunderstood. And one of the major conclusions of our reporting is that what happened on January 6th is so often rightfully cast as a domestic democratic crisis, but it was also a national security crisis because the rest of the world was not briefed, prepared, or ready to understand what was happening. And Milley, through his back-channel military communications, was hearing from allies and adversaries alike questions, sharp questions, really worried questions about whether the United States of America was stable. Was Trump actually going to stay in power? Was this a coup at the United States Capitol? And so Milley, as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, took it upon himself to offer reassuring messages to avoid any kind of panic reaction from an ally or adversary, especially with the Chinese. Already, it was a hair-trigger environment in the South China Sea. And Milley has a back-channel relationship with many military leaders across the world for this exact kind of scenario to make sure that they don't misinterpret what's happening and start to militarize in some dramatic or drastic way. And so Milley called General Lee, his counterpart, and said, look, what's happening is bad, but the United States is stable. The election's going to be certified eventually. Just stay cool. And he told all the people in the South China Sea with the U.S. Navy, be cool. Let's not have exercises going on right now. Let's not start flying jets a little close to China. Let's keep everything cool. And then you saw at the DNI, the CIA, as we write, everything was antennas up because they could tell the rest of the world had no idea. None of the diplomats, the political intelligence officers, the secretaries of state across the world had prepared world leaders for what was happening in the United States because it was so out of the blue. They knew Trump was disruptive, but this was a possible coup in the world superpower. And so Milley, in his view, needed to calm things down. And he also knew that in his view, Trump was in mental decline. That's his conclusion of Trump up close, based on our reporting. And in that moment, 2 days after January 6th, on the morning of January 8th, he does two things. He calms down the Chinese back channel, General Lee. And I think this is important for history. He took that step, worried about the U.S.-China situation. And he also had a conversation with Speaker Pelosi. And one of the documents we discovered and reported on in the beginning of the book is the transcript of a call between Speaker Pelosi and General Milley. And it's a historical, fascinating artifact in my view, because to see the alarm in print, a transcript, and that's why Woodward and I discussed how we're going to do this. Should we segment it out? I said, let's just put it in. He agreed. Put it all in, because let people read it. And the conversation speaks for itself. She says, you know he's crazy, and Milley doesn't seem to disagree in any way. And she has real alarm as a constitutional officer that the president's unhinged. And she says, you better make sure that he's not going to fire off some nuke or do something crazy. And he says, don't worry, Speaker Pelosi, everything's fine. But he knows not everything's fine. He had seen Trump disintegrate, in his view, since the summer of 2020 with George Floyd. And Milley and Esper, remember, they're pulled across Lafayette Square, embarrassing for them, when Trump holds the Bible up in front of St. John's Church. And Milley's in military fatigues. And since that moment, he had seen Trump fall in terms of his mental health, in his view. So what you see with Milley is someone who pulls in the officers, the command center of the Pentagon, and he says to them, look, and he's very careful with what he says, because he does not want to be seen as jumping into the chain of command, because that would be seen as a military coup. There's only one person in our system who can make these kind of decisions on firing weapons, president, commander-in-chief. But Milley says he brings them in, very much like a Schlesinger moment, and he says, look, if anybody calls from the White House or anybody else, he never mentions Trump's name. If anybody calls with any kind of a stray order, just make sure I'm on the network. Make sure I'm alerted. He's not saying, make sure I make the decision. He's not saying, let me be the president of the United States. But he's trying to give a very not so subtle message to the National Military Command Center. These are the people who monitor the weapons and fire the weapons if it comes to that. That be careful, because we are in a strange environment.
It's breathtaking. What if, because I think COVID played a huge role in the 2020 campaign, what if Trump from the outset had told the truth, that the country was facing a pandemic, it was a grave threat, it wouldn't go away soon, people had to take precautions while a vaccine was being developed? Instead of seeming to wish the plague away in public while telling Woodward in private that it was a real crisis, do you think it would have been a different outcome to that election?
It's very possible. I mean, it's hard to Monday morning quarterback Trump's handling of COVID. I mean, he was so wanting to wish it away. And it's interesting now that he's on the vaccine.
He's attacking the vaccine, which he helped develop.
Because Governor DeSantis, his possible rival, is having all these studies now of the vaccine in Florida and raising questions about the vaccine, and that creates a threat politically in the view of many Trump allies and advisors on the right. Someone who's more critical of the vaccine could be a real threat to Trump getting that anti-vax vote inside the GOP. If Trump had handled it different, sure. I mean, Trump having covered and known Trump since 2011, I've always thought of him as someone, put aside all of his conduct, politically was an independent type president or political figure, and that with a different type of personality or character, the country seemed to be craving something different. And so many people I met in 2015, 2016 who identified with Trump were not Republicans. They were non-voters, people who didn't participate in American politics. And he brought out people who were alarmed about trade, alarmed about immigration, many working class voters, in a way that was new and significant. And if he was ever able, which he was not in any way, but he was ever able to take that new coalition and build a new political party or a new politics, he would be a transformational, historic president. Because the frustration in the Republican Party with George W. Bush-style politics on intervention in Iraq, on going after it in the Paul Ryan-style Medicare and Social Security, deep frustration. There was an opening for a new type of Republican. And in the Democratic Party, because of their own ties to Iraq and to the political establishment, to Wall Street, there was an opening there. And that's in part the rise of Sanders. And Trump, it's a historic what if he was a different type of person, what could have happened? Because even going back to 1992 with Ross Perot and Pat Buchanan, there was that impulse in American politics for an independent, populist person. And William Jennings Bryan, now on the right. So anyway, I could go on for a long time.
My own view, by the way, is he was temperamentally incapable of handling the pandemic in the way that would have advanced his prospects for re-election.
And he
could have looked like a crisis commander-in-chief who was doing his job.
Having covered him for over a decade, he did not change as president. He aged, but he didn't change. And so many people sometimes rise to the presidency. You're a student of the presidency. You've guided more presidential campaigns than probably anyone in America. And the presidency, usually even running for it, changes people, elevates them, but not in the case of Trump.
Yeah. Now, he's thinking about running again in 2024.
Trump?
Yeah.
He's already announced.
Right. But
that shows you his campaign's not getting much traction if Bob Shrum forgets.
I'm not sure he's going to run.
Trump?
He's announced, but I'm not sure he's going to run. But
I see what you mean.
Yeah. I think if he looks at it in 4 or 5 months and he thinks he might lose, he might very well back off. But I don't know. You know him better than I do. I only met him once. I met him in Paris in 1987, had lunch with him, and I asked him, he said, God, I just came back from Russia. And he had a wonderful time, and there were so many business opportunities. And I said, did you go to the Hermitage? And he said, yeah, it was nice. And I said, how does it compare to the Louvre? And he said, I've never been to the Louvre. I said, but Donald, you must come to Paris all the time. He said, yeah, with her, with Ivana. He said, and all she wants to do is go to dress stores, and I go with her, and it's Madame Trump this, Madame Trump that. Nobody gives a damn about me. And he says, is the Louvre worth it? And I said, it's really quite extraordinary. And the next morning, Mary Louise and I were going out to get a coffee on the Champs-Élysées, and he's standing there in the lobby. He said, Bob, we're going to the Louvre. You want to go? And I lied and said, listen, we have a guide tomorrow. We're going to go all day. Otzi and I were the guides. And we came back after about an hour, and he's standing in the lobby. And I said, Donald, I thought you were going to the Louvre. He said, we did. It was great. Anyway, on a more serious note, because we don't have a lot of time, but and I'm not sure we're going to get to the Biden part of the book, but that's okay. All you have to do is listen to Bob, and you need to go buy this book if you haven't read it yet. Near the end,
it's on President Biden's shelf in the Oval Office.
Near the end, you quote Brad Parscale, who was Trump's campaign manager for much of the 2020 campaign until he had an unfortunate incident where he was basically, I think, drunk in the street. And
he was let go because the arena was not full.
Yeah, Yeah, that's another whole story. In Tulsa.
That's right.
There were going to be a million. What happened? Well, you tell the story.
It's
Your
a long-
book.
Well, the arena wasn't full in Tulsa because it was during COVID and Trump erupted and Pascal was put to the side.
Anyway, he says that Trump doesn't see 2024 as a comeback.
Vengeance.
He sees it as vengeance.
Vengeance.
And then shortly after that, in the final words of the book, you say, peril remains. You want to talk about that?
Well, Pascal is right in the sense that Trump's running because he believes he was wronged in 2020. And if you watched him recently in South Carolina and New Hampshire, he's not mounting a new ideological pitch. He's not coming up with a policy agenda. He's running out of vengeance. And I just wonder, as a reporter, is he running a playbook from 8 years ago? And is that still going to work? The world has changed in 8 years. Think about everything that's happened. The Me Too movement, more awareness of environmentalism, a new generation rising in Congress, people changing across the country in so many different facets. And Trump is still going back to the old 2015, 2016 playbook, talking about 2020. But the challenge for the Republican Party is Trump was on the Hugh Hewitt show this morning taking shots at Governor Youngkin, taking shots at Governor DeSantis. And when I talk to top advisors for some of these potential Republican candidates, they go, maybe our time's 2028. And they may say to themselves, sit out this one, because there's no upside to going into an arena with a man who's in his mid-70s, angry as heck, and wants to throw punches. And he's going to go after your family. He's going to mangle your name. He's used a Chinese slur to go after Youngkin. He has called DeSantis Ron DeSanctimonious. And if you get into the arena with Trump, he will fight. I mean, Trump once told me in an interview, he was joyous about how he loves to fight. And when he told Woodward and I he brings rage out, he smiled. And when he talked about fear being real power, he was happy. This is who he is. And that Trump still exists, even though he's older. And so many people, when you really sit down with some of these potential presidential candidates, they do have fear of Trump. Not of him personally, but of his base. And they don't have tolerance for political pain. The trait that's most identifiable in modern politicians I cover on the right and the left is that what I would call overthinking. They overthink their careers. They don't like to take risk. They want to manage everything with their decisions. But when you study the great histories of the presidency, you see that the great presidents, or sometimes the worst presidents, but at least those who made it, were willing to take political risk, endure political pain, to make tough decisions. But now all the politicians I cover seem to be surrounded by people my age in their 20s and 30s and early 40s, talking about social media strategies and messaging, and they're not able to just say, I'm going to jump in. I'm going to beat Trump. I'm going to get this nomination. They try to plot it all out. And Trump, for all of his faults, which are many, is I've seen him up close on his plane, looking at the newspaper, and he's a newspaper reader with big glasses. You would never see pictures of this. And he sits there with a Sharpie, and he circles articles and shoves them at advisors and thinks to himself, this is the news. I'm going to jump into the news. Now, his ability on this has dulled a bit since he's left the presidency. But when he was at his political peak, this is someone who never used advertising to generate national headlines. He would look at the front page of the New York Times or the Washington Post, come up with an idea, and then use that idea as a twist on the story to then call reporters over and generate news coverage for himself. And there's a certain brilliance to it as a political actor to not have to use advertising or messaging or set policy speeches to dominate the national news. He had an ability to figure out where it was all flowing and dive into the flow. And so many politicians, they fail because they think they can control the flow. You can't, but you have to figure out how to navigate it.
So Peril remains, and Peril remains a great book. And as I said earlier, if you don't have it, go get it now. I think Bob will sign it for
Happy
you.
to, sure.
And I want to thank you for not only this session, but for an absolutely extraordinary book and an extraordinary insight into how you find out the truth about what's really going on.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bob.